Kenneth Stevenson is a director and dramatist focused on the expansion of personal sovereignty. His career and scholarship extends to cinema, episodics, and advertising. In 2021, Kenneth contacted me upon viewing my film on Free the People, Real Unity, a piece of poetic prose screened at Freedom Fest's Anthem Film Festival. Intrigued by this expression of dissidence from what he calls a modern-day Walden Pond-style transcendentalism, Kenneth appreciated a distinctly sensitive approach to changing the world. During our interview, part 1 of 3, we discuss the growing desire for leaders who lead by inspiration, not force. We begin to explore Kenneth's running a film business during this authoritarian moment, and we also muse on an objective reality around liberty and something bigger than ourselves that wants us to be free. What makes the Declaration of Independence sacred as compared to a self-serving anarchy? Can the original American dream be revived with wonder and adventure? Ensuring that poetry and film is never dead. With Kenneth Stevenson, I'm Sienna Mae Heath, and this is Leaving the Left for Liberty.
Unity is only possible through acceptance. So I accept that unity from left to right might not be possible for a while, but we can choose to talk about it. We can start by finding healing and unity within our true selves. And like unity, truth is another word I never imagined could bring so much controversy.
It was back in 2021 when you first reached out to me with your initial thoughts on my film, Real Unity, which we released here on Free the People and screened at Freedom Fest. Back then, you seemed to be like one of the few who really, really felt touched by the film. I think a lot of people were intrigued. Some found it too utopian, dangerously utopian, which I can in part agree with now. But overall, my intention was to envision a spiritually inspired form of real unity in diversity of thought as it's also seen in nature. Just a very artistic perspective rather than such a socio-politically charged perspective on how we can come together in such a divided time. What was your response to the film initially, and what prompted you to reach out?
Yeah, I remember it pretty vividly, actually. I was in my office. I think it was sometime around the OSHA mandate, maybe the lockdown stuff all blurs together in my mind now. But regardless, where I was coming from, I was working remotely from home, and I think I was on my lunch break, and I pulled it up and was immediately struck by, um, I suppose I don't think I had seen up until that point someone self-identified from the left that um, was so brave and outspoken in coming forward from an artistic perspective and saying, like, this is how I feel in this moment. This is how this is affecting me. And it just so happened that I was feeling that from the right. And so it was this weird convergence of I just basically blocked all these friends from Facebook, narrowed it down to a small subset of people I'm related to that I hardly talk to anyway. And I was feeling pretty isolated and feeling like, oh, you know what? Maybe I did the stupid thing. Maybe I really shouldn't have, uh, you know, stuck my neck out because I had just done that. I had just put a post out that had said, I'm really disappointed in my immediate community. I really feel as if this is a time where we need to speak honestly about what foundational things in our country are going awry. And the response wasn't all that encouraging. And I got really frustrated. And when I saw you come on, I was like, wow, this sounds like a transcendentalist. This sounds like a Henry David Thoreau or you know, someone like that has a background and appreciation for nature and that is approaching that dissidence from that angle. Those people that I had been studying at Walden Pond, they kind of spoke like you did. And I was like, wow, this is kind of cool. This is someone that I would like to grab a beer with and have a conversation with. And that's really where that started.
Thank you for that feedback. Perhaps one of the metaphors that resonated with you was the flowers of one garden image, the idea that humanity is that we are flowers of one garden, that we thrive in our diversity, which is actually a principle that's more um, preached on one side than the other, you know. But I think from a spiritually inspired perspective, and actually just from the perspective of a gardener, um, I've come to see that in a more practical light. Like if you garden, if you grow your own food and flowers, which is something that I'm discussing on my new series, Food is Freedom, you know that there's all sorts of issues that can arise in a garden. There's pests, there's weeds, there's invasive species, and amongst plants, there are plants that don't belong together, and there are plants that are proper companions. There's actually a spectrum of antagonistic plants to companion plants, and there's literally something called plant families. So the metaphors are just endless as to how plant and people relationships relate. I didn't really get into that back then because I think I had a more optimistic view. I think I just had these like really strong ideals that I wanted to share and see, you know, how they would land and really just speak my piece. And you were one of the first to reach out, and I think perhaps us both being artists, we could really relate to a more sensitive approach rather than like the hard and fast. You know, this is how it is, and I'm telling you how it is, and trying to change the world. I think I was coming from a changing the world mindset at the time. And even like after 6 months of the release, when I went to Freedom Fest and we hosted a small panel before the viewing. It was interesting because there was a woman there who didn't want unity. Like she just very plainly said, "I don't want unity," and I felt like I was supposed to be representing my film, but that person wasn't quite who I was in that moment. I was actually escaping a family function to be at Freedom Fest and talk about unity. So I addressed what she was saying, and I said, like, honestly, like I get it. And I think what I came to not just understand, but like experience is that there are certain belief systems that are not healthy. You know, they, in plant terms, we could say toxic or invasive in a way that's not helpful to the whole and that like the health of companions and families, whether in the plant or the people realm. Um, and you know, the idea of unifying everyone all at once at that time in 2021 of all times was not possible. And that wasn't what I was saying. I was saying in the future, perhaps this is a hope or a vision that can be manifested.
Well, I appreciate that. And I can also appreciate how I think sometimes as an artist, we do get a lot of pressure to entertain people or to elicit a reaction, but sometimes you just need to get it out and you just need to say what you need to say. And I would wager that you had an impact on certainly more than just me. And I think that it's important in times of real turmoil and duress that there's people that are looking for reassurance, that are looking for a kindred spirit. And the fact that you put that out there, um, I was in a pretty dark place. And when I saw it, that made a big difference on me. I remember um, my first feature, this somewhat relates. I didn't know what the reaction was going to be because it was at the time when I was in college, it was what I didn't appreciate until later is that most of the ensemble cast members, we had like probably at least 200 people that worked on that film. And they were all over the Midwest. And I assumed that everybody bought into what I was trying to say. But what I didn't realize until later, especially during the COVID reaction, when I started seeing all of the actors come out and actually speak to what they actually believed on the idea of the mandates, mask and vaccine alike, I was like, "Oh my gosh, I had all these people working on this film that I cared so deeply about that was anti-authoritarian against the medical regime state that clearly went along with it." So what does that say about me as a creator that I couldn't even get my own cast and crew to buy into what I was trying to say. And what I'm trying to suggest is that even if what you suggested through real unity wasn't completely possible, I think it's what it needed to be said at the time.
Mhm. Well, I'm happy to hear that it brought you, maybe just in a small way, out of the dark place you were in. And I can definitely relate to feeling like a hypocrite, or like, how can I, reach strangers on the internet, or, maybe even certain friends, but my closest colleagues, or, other connections just don't hear me. They're the closest to me, like even in proximity, and they just, um, they actually, I remember, especially like in 2021, at the height of the vaccine mandates and a lot of the fear still, I would see friends like at the grocery store, and they would speak to me as if they didn't know what was going on with me. And like, I think they knew, it eventually came
Yeah.
out, they're like, we know. But it was like they were looking right through me. No matter what I said, no matter what I did, it just was, they weren't ready to meet me in my present moment. And I think as an artist, in the context of real unity, I think that was kind of meant to be like a work of poetry, maybe poetic prose. And some people received it as something like with an agenda, or they're kind of wondering like, well, what's the purpose of this? I'm like, I'm just sharing. I'm just trying to create something to spread some beauty during this ugly time. I hope you like it. Not every work of art or piece in the media is meant to change your mind. And I don't know that I really was changing minds. I mean, I suppose I was more so reaching for the heart.
Well, I
During the
think
election too, like, people thought that was dangerous, like, if you posted a quote about, like, just loving your
yeah.
neighbor, some people would say, "Hey, don't you can't talk like that right now."
But I think there is a real hunger that people have, and they're so dissatisfied with the leadership that I would say anybody that is voluntarily saying they wanna be a leader in this climate, that wants that power, is not a good that's not what we need right now. And when you say, "I wasn't even trying to do this," I mean, that's what made it so great, was I think there are people that are looking for leaders. And I know you probably hear that and you're like, "I don't wanna be whatever. I don't," or maybe whatever, but the fact is, like, people want that more reserved approach to leadership, that instead of this just very raucous, like, just rigid, sharp stuff that we have right now. And I think, look, every piece of diction that you as a poet put out there, or motif that I might put in a commercial or whatever, it adds some scaffolding that other dissidents can use in their own daily lives, in their conversations with people, and I don't think that can be stated enough. So, um, yeah, I think it was great. And like I said, the transcendentalists weren't necessarily running around with bullhorns screaming about, I mean, they were finding their own ways of doing civil disobedience. And I think, again, when you look at the movements that we've had, whether it was Antifa with mask on, or even the decentralized, or sorry, the sort of, with BLM, there's no clear leadership that could be found. It's been really frustrating to find people that we can identify that are courageous enough to say, "This is who I am. I'm not afraid to say it, and join me in that way." Everybody else is being cowards. They're just putting on masks and running around. So I don't know. I saw it as very courageous.
Oh, well, thank you. I Recently, I've been exposed to experiencing someone who's experiencing themselves as a dissident, but in a collectivist mindset. It's still in like, I need to join a group to then be a dissident. I don't think that's what happened, in the spaces that we're referring to. Like, I think for people like me and you, I know for like, other individuals I've had on my show, we're kind of just like, I want to say like cats, like Matt Kibbe says, like cats are libertarians. We don't come from herds, we don't come from identity based groups. We didn't start a club and say, we're all going to speak up and say the same thing and advocate for the same cause. It was more like, an organic sprouting and blooming of flowers, that just felt like we didn't quite belong. We didn't know if we were in the right garden, but it was just time for us to come to the
Yeah,
surface.
I
Yeah.
agree. I agree. Yeah, I don't know how you can call yourself a rebel in today's climate while while having the backing of corporations and people in the administration that so clearly do identify with what you're saying. I mean, that's what frustrates me right now is not to make it too, I suppose we can get into that now, but if you want, but it's like, look, some of the same folks that are running the ship right now, they've had the levers of power for 12 out of the last 16 years. If you guys were going to make any meaningful difference, you would have done it. You haven't done it. So, I'm all about second chances, but this is like, we need change and meaningful change. And I guess in the liberty movement, it's kind of frustrating, but I don't exactly see an analog for us right now in the race. Like, to the extent that we need like one that is purely not about, one team taking over the administration and imposing top-down ideology. It seems like we're stuck right now. So
Yeah, I think the old form of leadership is falling, like the old guard, as it's called. It's falling, it's disintegrating, and the integrative forces, if you will, forces and not like, enforcing, but just these naturally, evolving energies are creating a form of leadership that's through inspiration. It's not by force. I know for me, like, I am not effective at persuading people. That's not my skill. I'm not a debater. I'm not even like that interested in like being on like, a panel of discourse and like showing, different perspectives. Like for me, I think there's so much value in that. I just don't know if that's exactly where I belong. Like for me, I'm more of a like, I'm going towards the light. I'm working on this project. Whoever's joining me, that's cool. And we'll continue, maybe inspiring people or just inspiring ourselves and living life. And if any small part of that maybe changes the world, great. But
yeah,
if I can be true to the garden metaphor as much as possible, stemming from real unity, I think for artists, I would say like that's maybe more where we belong. It's like, I don't want to say in the front because that kind of like asserts a hierarchy, but kind of just going along and doing our thing and not trying to fight the old world.
yeah, it's I think about this a lot right now in like terms of the people that were at the forefront of the American Revolution. Like, you think about the Thomas Paines that wrote like Common Sense. You think about the Jeffersons, you think about some of these eloquent writers that they were dangerous with a quill, but they probably weren't all that great. Maybe they were, I don't know, with weaponry or whatever. I think there's different talents that lend themselves to the movement. And that's often made me wonder recently, like, what, in a sense, we have such an enormous responsibility, not to self-aggrandize ourselves, but it's like, you can move so many people to do things with art and with writing. And we've seen that's the case over and over again. I think the left does a really good job of it, like a really good job of it. I think the right is catching up, and it needs to like find a more authentic and emotional way of telling stories. And like, that's something like I'm really interested in. Um, but I feel like, just going back to, again, like Thomas Paine, and like, I mean, that guy was very responsible for instigating two revolutions, the American Revolution and the French Revolution. And, a lot of people don't realize, like, I mean, the French Revolution was incredibly brutal, incredibly brutal. And he even admitted, he's like, man, I think I may have taken them way too far on this one. Like, I think I maybe pushed them too far. Maybe the American one, it was just, he didn't think it went quite far enough. But I guess to wrap up my point, I just think that, um, what are your thoughts on, like, this is just a question, like, if you were to write something that were to inspire the next Sons of Liberty, like, obviously we're not soldiers. We're not people that seek out violence. We're not the people that want that. And even like Jefferson, when he wrote King George in the Declaration, was like, listen, we're trying to work this out. Like, we've tried all these things. You clearly aren't receptive to it. But there's been so much effort to try to make things happen through an artistic lens, but it seems like despite our best efforts, it's the people that come after us that we can't control that seem to take things in their own hands. It's kind of frightening. Um, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it's funny that you asked, like, if I could write something to inspire a group of people, because in private we were discussing that I really enjoy writing scripts, like monologues, which you mentioned are kind of like, well, I don't know if this is exactly your word, but it's kind of authoritative. It's like this is the purpose, this is the intention. It's almost like a mission statement.
Yeah, yeah,
Monologues
yeah.
are very like this is my truth.
In
This
the
is what we're
advertising
doing.
world, we call it a brand manifesto.
Yeah, yeah. Like I could definitely write a manifesto. I would be careful, not to. I would be careful. I don't know if I could write something to inspire the future sons of liberty. I mean, who would these people? Who would these sons be? Like, what is their motive?
Right. Well, I mean, I think that's, and I've been talking with you privately about this too, like how can you really guarantee who's going to take these words and breathe life into them? In some ways, I don't think you can. But I do feel, I mean, we've seen religious texts that mean something fundamentally different where heinous things are done that are literally the opposite of everything those words mean. Um, but going back to what you said about like you write with an authoritative stance, like the reason that I feel like so many people are attracted to that is not because it's authority for authority's sake. I think people want guardrails and they want some sort of scaffolding on which they can move forward and find meaning in their life. And I think that is a struggle I think that libertarians have that I've noticed where they can't seem to agree on anything. They can't seem to really come together over a unifying principle, um, much less a candidate to put up, um, that we can all agree with. So it's like, to me, the Declaration of Independence is a work of art. Like I literally do view the Declaration as sacred, and it freaks some people out when I say it like that. But I just think it is so important. Like in a nearby city that I live in, Jeffersonville, Indiana, there is literally like a rotunda piece of art. It's the circle of liberty, like the story of liberty, and it has these carve outs of all these beautiful men and women throughout the history of mankind, humankind, that just have contributed to that struggle we're all in. And I just think that we take that document for granted, and I do think we need more Jeffersons and Janes or whatever you want to call it to write with some sort of strong, disciplined voice, not to necessarily have sway over people's lives for that sake, but just to encourage people to speak truthfully about like there is an objective reality around liberty, like it exists, like and yeah, that's just
No, I think if I were to write something to inspire the next sons of liberty, I would write it to the sons and daughters,
hmm
first of all.
hmm
And I think I would perhaps question them first. Who are you to your core? What are your guiding principles? Rather than institute, like, this is what we're doing, this is our mission. If I'm just now getting acquainted with these sons and daughters, get a sense of what brings us all together. Um, Maybe it would actually be a list of questions rather than a manifesto initially. And when you mentioned something missing amongst libertarians, something like that, we're just not. I don't know if I want to say we, because I'm just an independent. I'm a free agent.
yeah.
I'm a millennial, so I don't like to be labeled. But there's something missing. It's not. There's no matter how many principles, like the non-aggression principle that libertarians have, for whatever reason, there's just not there's not a coalescing that happens amongst some other groups. That might not be a bad thing. I have a sense as to what might be missing, but what do you think is missing in those environments?
I think what's missing personally is the belief in something bigger than ourselves that wants us to be free. I believe that it's tricky on how to. I think the question of how do we take the examples that are strewn throughout, for example, the Old Testament of a people that get out from underneath the thumb of Pharaoh, get out from underneath the thumb of Nebuchadnezzar, you know, constantly are overcoming suffering and tyranny. I mean, to me, as a Christian, that's the real beauty of what I look for in the Bible is examples of people that get out from under these oppressive regimes. I mean, it's throughout the whole text. And I think that we need, for the framers, it was not all of them were of the same denomination. They were all pretty much deist to some degree, Masons that believed that there was something bigger than themselves. They would normally call it providence. And the declaration at the end of it, it literally says, to your point earlier, Sienna, about you would question what the motive is. He has in the document, like, listen, we really more or less are going to be seeking the guidance and the discernment from providence. Like we need to form something new after this King George thing that is by the people. And it's clear that it's not going to be anarchy. It's not going to be self-serving. So that's my interpretation of it is I think we need to have the courage to say, you know what, we can have a cutout in society for atheists. That's totally fine. There were atheists back in the day of the framers. But it doesn't change the fact that if you want a document to push people forward into a meaningful relationship, not just with themselves and their government, but something that they can trust, that is ideal, you have to believe in something bigger than yourself, something bigger than whatever party or machine, you know, is pushing it forward. That's my thought.
If something could be written further to the Sons and Daughters of Liberty, perhaps it would be a manifesto of sorts, bottom up, not top down, exploring the risks of liberty and how to discern between like one's base desires and one's spiritually inspired desires. And, what are your motivations for wanting a certain thing, a certain freedom? And the Handmaid's Tale, the character of Aunt Lydia suggests that there's freedom to and freedom from. And she says, in the old days, you were given freedom to, and now you've been given freedom from. Be grateful. I in no way advocate for a Handmaid's style dystopia, but I think there's wisdom there to consider freedom to and freedom from. If we have freedom to everything, then we have anarchy. And as you mentioned, that can be self-serving. But if we believe in something greater, it's not that we're going to take away liberties, but we're going to arise to a place, or begin to, where we embrace the freedom of, it's cliche, but the freedom of the human spirit. And what actually liberates us from the constructs and the confines of a material reality. What is actually bringing us down? Is it that, I don't know. I don't know if I want to bring in certain, judgments about the world, but is it that we can't get enough of this terrible product? We just have to have it. We just have to have, whatever it is that we're addicted to in the material world. Should we celebrate certain things that are inherently lifeless or disintegrative or just not, encouraging spiritual growth? It's not to say that we should restrict this and that, but what are we celebrating? I find that on an individual basis, what a person celebrates says a lot about them. What cause perhaps, or what belief do they elevate to such an extent that it's their God?
Yes. And of course, the real challenge that I think we're facing is traditionally it's always been, how big of a state do you want? And, at a certain point, the state does become God. It does become God. And it is viewed as a source from which you can derive all of your whatever you want. And so I think it's natural, unfortunately, at a certain point when you elevate the state to that degree that you stop looking for the transcendent and you atrophy in your ability to kind of conceptualize what that is. You become cynical and you think, well, what's that invisible transcendent force giving me? Like right now I'm getting kickbacks from these politicians on Capitol Hill, and that's pretty good for me or whatever. I think, you know, if you and I were to sit down, and this is being super presumptuous about, I don't proclaim to be anything close to a scribe like Jefferson, but if I were to sit down and try to describe this idealized, what would I want my kids to walk out into? Like if they walked out this front door, it would be the ability to look out at the world in its natural form and have the safety and security to conceptualize what could be, like something bigger, without being distracted by all these reminders of this other thing, this idol. I mean, I really do feel that way. That's what's strange. Like when I go out, if I can't walk 15 minutes without seeing a US Postal Service truck, a any number of public services that are taxpayer provided, it's like, okay, on an individual level, yeah, those things help people. But at a certain level, I'm also like, gosh, they're going to give me everything. Like I don't what why would it's a brutal in my opinion it's a brutal distraction that continues to send people spiraling into secular just secular gobbledygook. I mean, I know I'm ranting, but that's what I'm that's what I would want is there was so much promise in the initial declaration. There was so much idealism in trying to break free from tyranny over a tax that is much less than what we have right now, that was going over to pay a king to fight 2 wars with Spain and France. I mean, does this sound familiar? We literally went to war over so much less, and we've been neutered to the point and conditioned to where we're just like, well, I mean, it's like that to me is the real tragedy is people talk about the American dream as in like, oh, you can buy this and you can buy that and you can have a home and do all these things. Whatever. I'm that's great, but I want the original American dream back. I want the OG, like I can hope to have a life for me and my posterity, uh, posterity, sorry, that there's wonder and there's parts on the map that are left to discover. And instead, I'm being given everything as if it's defined and has all these regulations around it.
Well, with so much being handed to us, not all of us, not all the time, but enough that we can say, yeah, we live in a consumerist society. There's less and less room for creation. Like, well, why should I, why should I create in-person community when all of my correspondence can be delivered to me digitally or via the postal service? I actually like that example because I was thinking the other day, I'm like, God, how much time do I spend on my phone just talking to people and then organizing events, and organizing get-togethers and hangouts and doing stuff. I just wish everyone was like on the same commune and we could just walk down the road and do it organically. It shouldn't be that hard. Am I just ranting now? It's like, let me just
No,
toss my phone in the trash.
No, it's just such a hop, skip, and a jump to becoming a Marxist. So that's
Wait,
what's
really?
so
No.
well, I mean, communes, the talk about look, I have an uncle in Tennessee that was a hippie, still is there, that runs a commune. And he's the leader of this commune. And they live off the grid. They drink coconut water all the time. They're singing and talk about unity. I mean, man, very united, very spiritually in touch with everything. They're delivering their children naturally. They're it's it's a lot, and they're doing it apart from largely the government. Um, but at the same time, what keeps happening to them is they're running into shortages. They're running into the ability to sustain it, and into problems that is. And I think it's. Well, I want you to carry on though. What else would you like to see?
Well, apparently a Marxist society. I didn't know that's
No,
what I
you're
was alluding
not. I
to.
didn't. That's not what I meant. That's not what I meant.
I would like to see more communities, though, with plots of land, and I think maybe just like in the environments of like smaller cities, more regular, not just spiritual practice, but like simple enough, just like potlucks, and
Yeah.
eating together, sharing tasks, like just so that we're not like in on an individual or like the microcosm of a family level, just in the grind of having to do menial tasks on our own. I don't think we're meant to be isolated in the way that we
No.
are, and it's very easy to do that when so much is delivered to your door.
Yeah. That is very, very true. I think it's I struggle with this because right now, like I mentioned in the previous conversations, we were talking about this idea of an autonomy index. And like right now, so much of what's driving me in my work and my daily life is how do I make myself as useful as I can in the event that something happens to that federal or state government. Like, I hate to say it, but I'm already kind of banking on it. I don't think it's going to last. I think it's going to be, I think something, I don't know what it is, but um, that was kind of the feeling that I got when I went to DC, when I was talking to Congressman Massey and I was talking to some of these politicians. Like, I was sitting there having drinks with them. I mean, they were literally telling me, like, I don't think it's going to get any better. I think the best thing anybody can do is to make sure that they know everybody in their neighborhood, they can take care of one another, and we can get back to the basics. And which is kind of like what I hear what you're saying. Um, but that autonomy index for me is like, okay, do I know how to grow and cook my own food? Do I know how to work wood? Do I know, some basics and all of these different things? Um, because for me, I do think I was just listening to Brett Weinstein. He was talking about if the world ends tomorrow, who's the one person you're going to call? Like, who's the person that knows enough about stuff and is rational that can talk you through that event? And what's really scary is a lot of people don't have that person. They don't know who their phone call is going to be.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
go ahead.
During the pandemic, quite a few people called me asking how to grow your own food. And it was kind of an interesting like turns of the tables because, certain people who thought I was just like, oh, just a hippie, like, oh, she works from home and she has her seedlings. How quaint, your life must be so easy. And then suddenly there's a shortages at the grocery store and people are frankly just stir crazy and they want something to do and they want more beauty in their lives. And suddenly I'm that person that people call. And I'm like, well, well, well. Well.
That's hilarious. Yeah, I I don't know how many people would call me. Uh, I there was a lot of people. I'd like to think some would, but there's a lot of people during the pandemic that just kind of revealed their colors to me. I was just like, man, it's not even about ideology at a certain point. It's almost like it's like, okay, if it really came down to it's the end of everything, um, they weren't going to be there. Like they weren't even going to be close, and it was sad to see that and realize that. Um, but it also kind of like in a weird way to bring it back to spirituality. That's when I realized, like, man, I really need to have a relationship with God of some kind because you don't necessarily have to be a loner all the time. If you believe in something transcendent in times of discomfort when everybody else seems like they're so far off base from you, you gotta I think you have to believe that, there is something transcendent that's with you. Um, but I agree with you. It's not good to be alone all the time. Isn't that in Genesis? It's not good for man to be alone.
Yeah,
Um,
specifically man. I think women can handle it better.
why do you think that?
Well, it's not that they are alone, but like they tend to gather, like women tend to have more friends, and I think men tend to isolate themselves, maybe just, I don't know if it's to their nature.
Oh, yeah, there's probably
Like
something to that.
amongst couples, like usually it's the woman who creates the friend group, and then like the men are friends with the friends' wives. It's not always like that. I don't know like what your experience is, but I've seen that more in like the older generations.
Got it. Yeah. That's an interesting observation, yeah.
Mhm.
I think, yeah, so do you feel do you feel that we are, in terms of sovereignty, better off focusing I guess my question for you is this, like, I've recently thought the larger that we gather at scale, the more threat there is for things to go badly wrong, like really wrong. Um, so in other words, like, was there some genius in constraining our sovereignty to these territories? Like a lot of people write it off like, what's that invisible line these states really mean anyway? Like it doesn't really matter. And the more that the pandemic went on and the more like all of these like authoritarian measures kind of get passed, I'm like, oh, I really do think there is something to us not scaling, especially like you think about like AI, like that terrifies me of these planners, these schemers getting their hands on algorithms that claim to have all the variables figured out that say, "Hey, listen, you just give me this much more power and I'll flatten all this out and all of you folks, regardless of what country you're in, it's going to be okay." Like, do you ever think about stuff like that?
Mm. I don't think I dwell on it as much anymore. No. But thank you. Thank you.
Oh
Thank you
no.
for that.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I Something I do think about when you mention the pandemic time, I feel like I know we really need to just forgive. But I distinctly remember in the winter that was supposed to be the winter of death, for those of us that didn't get injected. I had also heard that in Canada, in a part of Canada, grocery stores or I think were required by the local government to request papers uh,
Mhm.
proving vaccination. So essentially, if you weren't vaccinated, you couldn't enter grocery stores unless the grocery stores didn't follow those rules. And it just really hit me, between like Biden's rhetoric and that news. Um,
Yeah.
and I guess like I'm also just really passionate about food sovereignty too. Like it hit me in a few different places. Um, and my reaction was to go to the grocery store, and there's a grocery store in walking distance from my apartment. So I walked down and got some things. And as I was walking up, a friend of mine bumped into me and she asked how I was doing. And I tend to be a pretty like forthright, transparent, vulnerable person. But in that moment, I'm like, why would I bother telling you?
Mm,
And like I think that the scales had really tipped, and it had really shown who was going to stand up and who wasn't. And
yeah.
it was pretty clear even in my local community, like who was going to say anything, if I'd be denied access to a grocery store and who hadn't. And actually, I thought maybe I was being a little over dramatic about that. I had actually written a series of 10 questions um, regarding things that had happened during the pandemic. Like if this were to happen locally, like, okay, to me, your friend,
Yeah.
what would you do? Would you say something? Would you do something? And a lot of people actually were very interested in the questions. I could actually maybe put them in the description or the comments of this episode and send them to you. They were thought provoking, and they were very pointed. Like, I never thought I would have to ask these questions. Like, if I was being denied access to a space with food, would you say anything? And then, funny enough, well over a year later, that question actually became very relevant because I was at an
Mm.
agriculture conference and one of the groups was still enforcing the vaccine mandate to register for a dinner. A year and a half later, like early 2023. And, I guess I wasn't so crazy after all to be asking those questions ahead of time.
I went to Canada for a shoot, and I was really struggling with how to feel about it because I was so angry with the trucker, uh, situation, and I was struck by a couple things. One, in Vancouver, the city was so beautiful. It was so well constructed, so well engineered. Someone put a lot of design to it. But the more that I started walking around and looking at storefronts and how administratively everything was coming in, that there's a price to be paid for that uniformity. It's beautiful and it's deceptive, but on the other side of it, you're gonna have to act and behave the way that the regime wants you to behave. And, anything from, like, the food, like, was overly descriptive on all the printed literature about, this is what you're doing to like, this is basically telling you how you're destroying your body, everything you're eating. Like, it was very, like, so regulated to the point where I just felt noxious, like, walking through it. The airport was so overbearing. But I resonate with what you're saying. I was struck most by, um sorry, my dog is going crazy. Come here, buddy. I was also struck by, like, in my community of business entrepreneurial friends, like, there were daycare owners, there were, school teachers, there were just the whole essential versus non-essential thing. Like, people started stratifying, like, quickly. People started snitching on each other. I would go to my doctor, and he would say things to me under his mask like, "Hey, before we start talking about your health, we should talk about the health of the community." It's like, "Dude, I'm paying you as a doc like, our relationship is supposed to be sacred, a doctor and its patient. Like, why are you talking about the community right now?" Like, don't get me wrong, like, I care about my community, but people just lost their minds. I mean, I remember coming back from, Tennessee, and my wife and I tried to have a very, like, reasonable approach at first with the pandemic of like, "Yeah, we'll play along, we'll do all the things, whatever." And then when it came to our children, when they started, like, forcibly nasal swabbing with these giant nasal swabs that barely even fit in their noses, and I'm just looking from car to car as all of these young toddlers are hysterically breaking down, because these people that they had administering all these things, they were barely trained. I mean, it was just it doesn't even matter if they were trained though, because the fact is, in a weird way, in their attempt to save life, they devalued it. I mean, that to me was the key thing, was everybody became a data point on a clipboard, and that was it. That's all you were. And I remember getting robocalls because people would tell me, "Oh, if you get the vaccine, your information won't be stored in a database anywhere. There's no way they'll know. There's no way they'll know." And for getting like a call because I stupidly acquiesced and did the first dose and said, "Screw this, I'm not doing this anymore. You guys are crazy. You can hate me, I don't care." I got, just robocall after robocall of, "Hey, just checking in, how you doing? Was it a good reaction? Was it not?" It's like, "You're not supposed to know who I am. Why do you have this information?" And the same thing was true with, you know, the mask and the testing. What a disaster. As a business owner, again, 3 different states, 3 different sets of guidelines, you know, um, the testing, people just emailing each other tests without any concern about privacy or HIPAA considerations. Like, people really lost it, and I really don't think we were that far away from. I mean, it felt like a Bolshevik. People were snitching on each other. It was terrible. I know I'm preaching this to you because you experienced it just like everybody else. It's just, how did we get there?
And now what? Because just as most families do, we did we like collectively did not properly discuss what happened in 2020 and 2021. There's just like this mass avoidance of it, like the way people can like look right through me too. It's just, it creeps me out. Like like even just, just the other day there was that mandate, like, and now today we're going to like a festival together. Like,
Do you
what
remember
happens if
when Biden?
they
Do you remember the State of the Union where Biden just like walked in and it was like, "All right, we're done with mask. We're done." Like it just happened. There was no like rational explanation. It just unfolded, and then the State of the Union is strong. What are we talking about right now?
No, it's not. No,
It's
it's not.
crazy.
And without resolving, I mean, it's, goes way past the pandemic, but since we're talking about in that context, without resolving those tensions and I would say injustices, and without like, maybe just even enough like time and space for forgiveness, we're in even, I guess, more divisive time. I don't know how to measure it. But you had mentioned to me on private that with the election coming up, it's going to be harder and harder, in your view, to not take sides.
Yeah, I'm really dreading it. I'm really dreading it because I don't want to. You know, I think like artists, like you look at, I don't know if it was Fitzgerald or Steinbeck or whoever went overseas during World War II and got caught up in the anti-fascist movement, um, and then came to learn about what Stalin was doing. Like, I don't want to choose between a neo-communist and a neo-fascist, whatever. I just don't. And it's hard for me to know day to day who is truly advocating for that. There are days I wake up and I'm like, that's not really fascist. No, it's not. Just stop worrying about it. Stop thinking about it. You're overthinking it. And there are other days where I'm like, that sounds pretty fashy to me. Like that's pretty bad. And but it's a confusing time we live in because I would argue what we lived through in that totalitarian moment with COVID was fascist. I mean, I would argue that was it was very much oriented in that direction. I mean, I felt like just the definition of like matching and nationalizing to some extent the production of these products and then forcing them on people and then stratifying society and making people snitch on each other and uh, even to the point where they're going to start they start regulating commerce to the extent like it feels like we're already there. So to me, when people are like, oh my gosh, it's all going to turn into Weimar Germany again, I'm like, okay, I see it, but I also don't know where you've been the last 3 years. Like, where have you been? Have you not noticed the Twitter files? Have you not noticed literally half the population hasn't had a voice for like 3 years? Like, I want to empathize and I want to meet people with where they're at, but I have no idea how this is going to play out. I don't know.
I don't know. I mean, we've been talking for over 3 hours. So by the time we release this episode, maybe we'll have a clear idea of how it's going to play out.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what are your thoughts? I mean, do you think?
Well, sometimes I find myself saying, well, I mean, maybe I'm overthinking it. Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe a lot of what I'm nervous about, I'm just seeing online in the news, new media, Instagram. Maybe it's just quote unquote fear based, or fear corn. I'll say it to censor myself. But then things still happen like right in my face where I'm like, huh, yeah, I mean, I think, I think people have been so scared that like on a deep psychological level, they will kind of fall for anything. And while the gender issue is just, I mean, for me, it's just played out, everyone knows what I think. I just think it's such a perfect example though, like of how people can really fall for anything. If you can convince people that a man is a woman, anything is possible. And so I don't know how it's going to play out, but even if there wasn't an election, or even before this election season, I was pretty pessimistic, but I also didn't want to dwell on it because who's to say? Um, we had talked about in the previous episode whether violence is inevitable and whether the origin story of our country, and the belief of the Tree of Liberty being watered by the blood of tyrants is just unavoidable. Is that where we're headed again? Will we ever break free of that cycle? Is there something sacred about watering a tree with blood? I don't know. I have, maybe I missed something in the Old Testament about that.
As far as the
Like
necessity
watering trees with blood. I was just saying it tongue in cheek, but I mean, do you think that we're just in a cycle in this country of violence being inevitable and what some would deem necessary to achieve a divine justice?
I personally feel like we are about to experience a great undoing of a lot of what we have thought was just normal and true for the US since World War II. And I know I've alluded to it, but I really do think that Americans got complacent after the world wars and thought we were the heroes. We set the world order. It's us and Russia, and that's all we need to worry about. And I think honestly, that's why part of what we're experiencing right now is playing out is we're still looking at Russia as if it is the end all be all. Like, look, I'm no fan of Russia I should say the government of Russia or Putin or the KGB or any of that stuff. But I'm like, listen, where are you at when your government is doing some of the same stuff? Like, does anybody reflect on some of that? Because it feels like that's a necessary step that needs to be had. And if you want to regain the trust of the people, you have to trust the people. You have to trust the people to do and run the government the way they want to run it. And I think that since Trump got into office, I don't know how you feel about this, but it's almost like in our democracy or what's left of it, the powers that be couldn't stand that Trump or the people might, out of choice, elect to not be part of the greater world order. So what does that mean? Like, we tend to think unity with the world is a good thing. But if the majority of the people, like they did in 2016, vote against that, and they say, listen, our needs aren't being met. We're trying to do this through the ballot box. We're trying not to be violent. Will you please listen to us? Will you please listen to us this time? We want our sovereignty back. If the people vote to not be part of that world order, what wins out? Democracy or world unity? Like, that's where I feel like we're at.
That's interesting. Democracy or world unity. Are you concerned as to what we would unify around?
I'm simply saying that we can't have it both ways, and the same phenomenon is being experienced all over Europe with the Brexit thing. It's being happened in all these Western societies, that a lot of the freedoms that we value, that we're able to exercise independently within our territories, those are drying up and going away in favor of a holistic world approach, whether it be climate change, whether that be food scarcity, whether that be vaccine mandates. These crises are going to continue to come about. And they have the blueprint for it now. They have a playbook for it. And I'm not even saying they're necessarily sitting back in a room and scheming about it. I'm just saying it's obvious that they're going to do it again. And so, to me, the choice in this election is which administration, regardless of how annoying I feel both of these people are, which administration is going to give me my sovereignty back so that we have a fighting chance in the years and decades to come to try and build back up in a way that allows for that autonomy. I hate to say it, but I don't think that any of the people that are screaming diversity from the rooftops right now, or screaming about equity, or screaming about preserving democracy, I don't think that continuing to push us on the world stage the way they are is going to guarantee that. I don't want to be in a world war. I don't want to send people to die in foreign conflicts. I mean, and another way to say it is, it feels like right now we have an administration that values the legal contracts that were signed in treaties in World War II than they value the sovereignty in our founding documents. And you can't have it both ways. You have to choose which one is more important. We can try to have both, but if you're putting the alliance pacts and you're putting all of these decisions that the United Nations have signed above our Constitution, above our Declaration of Independence. And by the way, we don't even get a vote anymore in Congress when we go to war. Like, we literally have set up endless wars, in my opinion, in a situation where we have to have massive change. So again, I don't love, quote unquote, the orange man. I don't I don't love the mean tweets. I don't like the personality. I wouldn't want my kids in a room with him. He's just not a model person that I would want to be around. But unfortunately, these are the selections we have. So what are we supposed to do? I want to know what you think.
Well, I think as much as we can attempt to project what's coming, we can maybe just center it more on the individual level of like, what what role do you see yourself playing or embodying that's um, creating the kind of world you want to see, or really in a way just kind of keeping to yourself and protecting your own as an artist, as a filmmaker. Where are you headed? What are you working on, and how do you see that fitting into the larger context of our country?
That's a really interesting question. I want to continue leveling up my personal autonomy so that regardless of what happens, I am prepared to rise to the occasion and help other people rise to the occasion as well. Like, I want, through a spirit of voluntarism, because I really believe that, to be able, when things do, and I believe they will get bad. And I think when they get bad, I don't want what happened during COVID to happen again. So to me, to answer your question, it's teaming up with think tanks and brands and agencies that are liberty conscious and making commercial work that speak to these themes, that get people excited about it, not just with dread, but to get joy in embracing some of those things again. Um, you don't have to be MAGA to love liberty. You don't. You don't have to be liberty. It doesn't have a label. It doesn't have a label. You can look at you and me. I mean, how we came to this conversation in the spirit that we did. I really think there are more people out there that are waking up and seeing that Team Red and Blue just aren't cutting it anymore. And maybe we can reach across the aisle. And I don't, to your original short film, Real Unity, think that that's a preposterous thing. I think when things get bad enough, I don't think we're going to have a choice. I think we're going to have to look at each other and we're going to have to say, you know what, for our kids, for whatever, um, what do we want here? So again, for me, it's being prepared, and I don't want to be in that same position I was in with COVID, where I don't know if you experienced this, but I would go to a holiday party and people were wearing masks, family, friends, whatever. And I hated thinking this way, but I said, you're too embedded in the system, you're too embedded in the system, and you're too embedded in the system, meaning you work in a hospital, you work for the government locally, you work over here. If something happened, you're too compromised to do anything. You're not going to act. And I hated that. I was so upset because it's so different from, I think, 1776, where it's a good thing that we have, by the way, gender equality, and we have the ability to go out and seek our own career paths and all these things. But in a weird, perverse way, I was looking at family members that had both two careers. They don't have the ability to speak meaningfully up. Like, if something really happens, how is that going to happen? Who's going to take care of the kids? Who's going to get them out of daycare? Who's going to it's I think those are the things that I got stuck on with COVID that I was so disappointed about, was whether it was by their own intention or not. And I don't think it just happened this way, but we're kind of stuck and we need to start leveling up as individuals, to your point, so that we can rise to the occasion. So I really think it's like, hey, honey, I know that, you don't agree with me exactly on these three things, but can we all agree that these this list of things are deal breakers? And if these things are deal breakers, what can you do every day as an act of dissidence in service of that? That's how I think. I literally think every day, like, some people are like, what's that act of service you can do every day? to me, it's what's that act of dissidence that you can do every day?
Oh,
I
I
really
love
think
that.
that I think that that's important. I think that not everybody has the same resources. Not everybody has their own business. Not everybody can do the same things. But everybody at some point is gonna have to get on board with, you know what? I'm gonna get that little piece of me out there in the world by doing this. And it's not just to spite somebody. It's but it's the same reason that I don't think, if whether it's Biden, Kamala Harris, it's not as much as they annoy me, it's the machine that I don't like. I don't like that machine. And I don't like what it's doing to my community, to my family, to people in the country. And yeah, for me, it's going to be inspiring people through podcasting, commercials, documentaries, poetry, all of it. You said earlier, Sienna, it seems like we didn't learn any lessons. Whether it comes from a sense of anger or sadness or a little bit of everything, I will never let these people forget what they did to us. I will never let them do that. And I will make sure that it's going to be my life's work, whether it's through, um, showing what happened, uh, in both the aftermath and maybe there were some joyful elements of forgiveness that came after, but we cannot just move on from this. There has to be a reckoning. Um, and it doesn't need to be violent, but it has to be something.
Mhm.
What are you gonna do?
Oh, what am I gonna do? Well, I've been more consciously creating community. I was actually abroad in Portugal for 2.5 weeks, um, for a faith-based conference and actually exploring some, I guess, some land on Madeira Island. There's a friend of mine there who's a real estate agent and a new media producer and a musician, just super cool guy. Actually, he was my first guest on Food is Freedom. His name is Nabil, and he's a nutritional therapist as well, which is what brought him on the show. I am consciously creating community. I don't want to be stagnant, and
Mhm.
creatively, I'm working to create a more consistent writing practice. I want to produce more poetry. I'm leaning more like towards uh, agriculture, and less towards like I suppose like acts of dissidence more in the sense of like speaking up, but more so like embodying the world that I want to see. And the most recent passion project I have is a gardening curriculum on the flowers of one garden philosophy, teaching about healthy plant and people friendships, and understanding that sometimes you just got to make space, from certain people or certain plants. And that seems to be really resonating with children and families. I think, children, especially like, in a religious context, they're told all these like magical principles about like how you treat people, and we're all one, and that's true. But in practice, I think it's helpful to have a more practical view of it. And yes, we are all one, but we all are not gonna be hanging out together in the same garden plot, perhaps.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's awesome. I'm really happy for you. I hope that continues to materialize in the way you want it to, and so where are you going? Out of the country? You're going to Spain?
Oh, I'm not definitely going, but I'm saying I was abroad in Portugal for 2.5 weeks,
Okay,
and I really loved it. Yeah.
cool. Well, I'm
Yeah.
happy for you,
Let's
and,
see.
wherever you go, I know you'll do good things, and I'm excited to see what comes next. I have to, pay for some of the sins of the pandemic in the sense that, this is a whole other thing, but the government we were one of those companies that took one of those government loans, um, to get through, and it was a poison pill, and so I'm gonna take some time to pay that off, and then I'm going to, return to my advocacy work and try to really do that, like I mentioned, through those artistic projects. I had a couple features in mind that I was really excited about, but I think so much just depends on movies are expensive, and I don't know what's gonna happen with the economy. I don't know what's gonna happen post-election with any of it. So, um, yeah, I'm excited. When are you thinking you might be going?
Well, to answer your question, I definitely want to go back to Portugal next July for that same Baha'i Faith conference and see some new and established friends.
Awesome, awesome. Well, thank you again, Sienna, for all this, and, I don't know, I recognize in comparing our responses to that question that obviously I have a little more anger to work through than you.
We can talk about that in private, okay?
but 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 I think it's good to be able to see one another working through it. So
Yeah.
anyway, thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you, Kenneth. Until next time.
Till next time.